Hi, everyone. Welcome to a Beyond Identity webinar. This time I am joined by a very special guest, Bob, who is our CISO. My name is Jing. We're going to talk about PCI DSS Revision 4 today. It's a super exciting and timely topic since the future PACE requirements go into enforcement today, essentially. So to everyone out there, good luck. We're here to help. If you want the slides or the recording later, we will be able to get that to you. Without further ado, I think we should hop into the content. All right, so as I mentioned, today's webinar is all about PCI DSS Revision 4, and I have Bob here because he has tirelessly led our company, Beyond Identity, through a number of compliance requirements. So I figured his insights would be good. My name is Jing. I lead product marketing. And Bob, do you want to do a quick intro, who you are, what you do?
Sure. Bob Burke, CISO Beyond Identity. I've worked in the security space for about 20 years, both in banking, retail, digital offers, led a number of initiatives in the industry and Connexus, driving digital offers, worked on the W3C working groups, and most recently at Beyond Identity, led the engineering and security effort, VP of Security and Engineering, and then more recently took on the exciting role of CISO at Beyond Identity.
Yeah. An exciting career in cybersecurity across all the fields for sure. Just a quick housekeeping. We're going to cover a few topics today. Obviously, we're going to lay out sort of the groundwork of PCI DSS, what's new, and then we're going to dig into some specifics around how to manage vendor risk, because it turns out the requirements have quite a bit to say about managing third-party risk. And then we'll sort of end with a discussion of how we as Beyond Identity can help you drive compliance. And I'm really looking forward to the last point as well, which is how to actually turn compliance from a cost center into something that drives business. And I know Bob has a lot of insights there, so definitely stick around. All right, first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about who is impacted by PCI DSS. My reigning assumption is that if you are here, you are most likely impacted by PCI. But per the standard, the regulation applies to any organization in the US that stores, processes, or transmits credit card and or debit card information. Obviously, this is sensitive information that consumers need protections for, which is why PCI actually is one of those regulations that actually has a pretty broad scope, right? Ranging from retail, e-commerce, all the way to tech vendors who may transact, in a PLG fashion. As long as you touch credit card or debit card information in your platform and transact, you are impacted by PCI DSS. Pretty straightforward, I think. So with PCI DSS, it's actually, revision 4 indicates that there was revision 2, 1, 3, whatever it is. Can you walk us through the timeline and how we got here, Bob?
Sure. So as what's typical for a lot of people on the call who work with standards, these things evolve over time, and they take quite a bit of time. So version 3.2.1 was a minor update in May 2018, and that was active all the way until March 31st, 2024. That's when they end of life version 3.2.1.1. And then if you look at the timeline, we had version 4.0, which has a lot of interesting stuff, and I think everybody would be excited to kind of look at those changes. That started that was initially released in 2022. So as typical with these standards, there's a 2-year overlap so that people can actually adopt and learn what the implications of those new standards are. And then we had in November of 2023, they had an addendum to the version 4.0 release, which is really just some refinements and some clarifications, but the core set of requirements didn't really change. And then as we end of life version 3.2.1 last year, that's when the version 4.0 became mandatory. Now it's mandatory with an asterisk because there's a large part of that which they call future dated requirements, which you were going to give an adoption period of 1 year. Well, that 1 year ends this month, which is March 31st, 2025. And this is when all of those requirements are now in best practices, including the future dated standards, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, are now required. So I suspect that all of you here are going to be working really hard to get your certifications over the next 6 months.
I had a quick question here, Bob. When you think about PCI DSS 4 and 4.0.1, is there like a need to recertify at all?
Yeah. So basically, you need to recertify against those requirements because they're mandatory starting in 2025. So as you start to talk to your QSAs, and they're going to require that you get certified. That certification period is generally 6 to 12 months, but that's pretty important that happens. And we're seeing a lot of activity from our customers now. We'll talk about what makes a good, trusted service provider. And we believe we're a very well-respected service provider. And when we work with our customers around compliance, but there's going to be a lot of activity over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, a busy time for a lot of teams for sure. So let's get into the newest revision. Can you share a little bit about what this revision is all about?
Yeah, so really it comes down to what the goals have significantly changed in revision 4.0, and it's really a good thing. I think there's an understanding now that where traditionally our requirements were very prescriptive, they had specific requirements on passwords and when you did an audit, how you reviewed your logs, and when you did risk assessment. Now the PCI standards are starting to adopt kind of the NIST and zero trust architecture of best practices from those standards, which is a good thing, because now a lot of our customers in the industry will start to see they'll have a set of architectural principles that some of these standards that have normally been separated and distinct, and now they can align around those common themes. But the primary goals for revision 4.0 are continue to meet security needs of the industry. And we'll talk a little bit about how some of the requirements roll under these goals. Enhance validation methods and procedures, add flexibility for different methodologies, and promote security as a continuous process. And for those of you who are watching this that are familiar with NIST, FedRAMP, or zero trust architecture, you'll see a huge influence in those standards. Like, for example, on the continue to meet security needs of industry, that's a really important goal. And as we talk through the standards today, you'll see that MFA falls under there. A lot of risk assessment falls under there. And a lot of the changes they're making, or the standards make around the new kind of threat models that are out there, or the threats, all fall under that security needs of the industry.
Yeah, it's super interesting that, PCI as a regulatory body is following this. Do you have any theories on why they're sort of looking to NIST as the sort of standard that they want to align against?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a natural evolution, because there are a lot of standard bodies out there, and and historically they've been very specific to industries. The payment card industry had their set of standards. You had FedRAMP, and the government had their set of standards. You had SOC standards, and then you have ISO standards. What you're seeing is you're starting to see a consolidation around some of those best practice standards, such as NIST. And it's really important, because then what that allows the different industries to do is to converge on common architectures and common controls. So, and people on this call probably have had to deal with all the different mappings you had to do through the different standards. As all of these different standards start to converge on those common set, like NIST and zero trust, those mappings then become transparent to the implementers.
Yeah. All right, let's actually get into some of the specific controls that are new with PCI DSS Rev 4. Can you share a little bit about what's actually new here?
Yeah, so there's a couple key areas. I mean, we have the new set of goals, which is pushing PCI to align around more dynamic controls and some NIST and zero ZTA, which we talked about. But then they break it down, and I haven't covered everything here, but these are the key areas. The flexibility model, which is they're allowing the vendors, or the customers now, to define what their outcomes are, strategic outcomes or security outcomes, and use different types of controls to achieve those outcomes, and it's less prescriptive. That's a really important part of the standard. Authentication, you'll see throughout the standards today that we talk about, there's a strong push for MFA. Before it was just for remote users. Now anything that touches the CDE, which is the cardholder data environment, has to have some kind of MFA solution. And there's a strong recommendation for phishing-resistant MFA solutions. Then there's some things that I'll jump over this pretty quick. There's strong key management encryption. That makes sense. And you'll see the influence of NIST there. There's another interesting push, which is coming from some of the more standard NIST frameworks to secure software development lifecycle, which is around secure coding. There's a strong push around SDLC because there's a lot of different threats that the PCI industry has recognized are coming from bad software development lifecycle and supply chain management. Then you have the logging and monitoring. You can't really do dynamic risk-based controls unless you actually augment all your logging and monitoring. Another big pass here is third-party management. This has been driven primarily, I think the PCI committee has recognized that all of us are really interconnected now, and any large company, doesn't matter how small or large, is requiring on third-party vendors. And so they recognize that as a gap, and they kind of drew from the NIST framework to look at supply chain management. So this is going to require, and we'll see this down a little bit, they're going to require people who adopt the PCI standard to have a stronger third-party vendor management process. And then, of course, risk governance, that's the dynamic outcomes. We just talked about that. You'll see that if you're going to have any kind of solution, it needs to support an architecture that's secure by design and compliance by design and enables a seamless and somewhat automated risk governance model. And then finally, on the risk-based security, again, that kind of rolls under risk and governance. That's central to any compliance strategy.
Yeah, I think once you actually lay it out, the fingerprint of NIST is pretty apparent, right? Everything from the encouragement of phishing-resistant MFA to this emphasis on dynamic, risk-based, adaptive, whatever it is that you want to call it, right? You need to be responding to risk, not on a static basis, but on a continuous basis, right? So earlier,
that's right. It's also, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add, I'm sorry, Jing, is also zero trust architecture. There's a strong influence there as well.
Yeah, that's right. So earlier you had mentioned, there's some requirements that are going into enforcement on March 31st, which is today. And can you just kind of walk us through what these specific ones are?
Yeah, so again, we just talked a little bit about this access control and authentication. And I put the requirements number on the side. This is a section that's been augmented to focus primarily on access control and authentication. That's where your MFA and your requirements are coming from. The logging and monitoring section, again, it focuses on making sure that the logging infrastructure and the logs that we produce are sufficient to support risk-based analysis. Again, it's really important that we're moving from a prescriptive model in the past, which means was more about, did you do maybe a manual view of your logs? It was kind of just very prescriptive. Now it's the expectation is that all the systems that you deploy in your ecosystem are generating enough intelligence so that you can make real-time risk decisions. Testing and vulnerability management, again, that goes back to the PCI industry really wanting to make sure that we have we know how to certify what we're delivering. And there's also a very strong push on vulnerability management, again, to address some of these emerging threats. And it's going to start pushing vulnerability management to be more dynamic and less static. And secure configuration of software development, we just talked about that. There's a hard push on that in that domain because there's a lot of threats that come from very poor software development practices. And more importantly, if anybody remembers the SolarWinds vulnerability, because we're more interconnected, your supply chain or your software supply chain includes all your vendors' software supply chain. So it's really important that there's a strong emphasis on how we build and deploy software. And finally, the governance and oversight, which we talked about just a minute ago.
Yeah. Obviously, when I look at this, and uh, I haven't actually led an organization through a compliance sort of audit or anything, but when I look at it, it seems like there's quite a bit of requirements that are coming through with the new revision of PCI DSS 4.
Mhm.
Based on your experience and what you've seen with our customers, which update do you think will pose the heaviest lift for organizations?
Um, yeah, I think it cuts across a number of areas. If I had to, so it's not just one thing, but I
Mm,
think I had to call it a couple areas that you need to focus on early is enforcing phishing resistant MFA. The reason that's such a heavy lift for a lot of customers is number one, um, for larger customers over the years, all these different systems have grown and they have different ways to authenticate and they have passwords all over the place. They don't necessarily, some systems don't necessarily integrate into their IAM solution. So I think in how you deploy that in a kind of a phishing resistant way is very important. I think that's a big one. Another one is going to be the burden on, I'll just give a couple, but I would call that as probably number one. Another one is going to be how do you get, now that you're pulling all these if you pull in third party vendors and all your legacy systems, they actually now need to be generating valid logging information so that you can do your risk-based analysis. And a lot of the legacy solutions don't have that. So everybody's going to have to go back and reevaluate and do an audit on all of their systems and make sure that they can be integrated into a SOAR kind of environment and SIM-based environment to enable threat detection. And then I think another big one is going to be, which was never emphasized before, but is really just, again, it's a software development lifecycle. You're really going to have to step it up and start doing things that are secure by design. The developers are going to have to change their behaviors. Vulnerability management and AppSec teams are going to have to be more integrated with the development teams. I would think those are some big lifts.
Yeah, yeah. They do sound like big lifts, especially when you talk about secure software development practices, right? There's the protocol you can put in place, and then there's almost like a cultural change that needs to happen as well within your teams to really prioritize security, right? There's a
Yeah,
few things you mentioned. Oh, finish your thought, and then I wanted to
I was
dig
just
into a
sure. That's exactly right. I mean, you can look at the technical stuff. There's the legacy architecture changes you're going to have to make changes to. You're going to have to fundamentally change your architecture in significant ways and start moving from security via operations to security through architecture. So that's a big part. But that's a technology thing. But what's more, and probably in a lot of ways, a lot harder is, I think you're exactly right. You need to start changing that cultural mindset within the organization. And we've been through that kind of transformation here at Beyond Identity when we got FedRAMP certified. It's the cultural, there are a lot of cultural challenges. You need to get in front of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost a parallel to implementing MFA, right? A lot of IT administrators are like, well, my users really hate it, but I have to do it. Speaking of MFA, I wanted to dig in here because technically PCI doesn't require phishing resistant MFA. Is my reading of that correct? So,
That is absolutely correct.
okay, so if let's say I'm a compliance manager and I'm thinking about how to minimize the load on my team. So if it's not required, wouldn't you think any MFA is good enough?
So the obvious answer is no, right? I mean, from an absolute security perspective, you want to have a phishing resistant MFA solution because there's a lot of attack vectors, credential stuffing, initial access, and credential access that you need to be aware of and you need to prevent. And in fact, that is one of the primary attack vectors, as we see over and over again, is credential access, basically stealing your credentials. So the security person, I mean, when you look at these standards, you don't want to take if you want to be apt, you don't want to take a minimalist approach. You always want to punch through the standards and you want to build your architecture so that you actually can satisfy those requirements and you go beyond them. Now, having said that, technically, it does not require a phishing resistant solution. It's strongly encouraged. And so an MFA solution that isn't phishing resistant would satisfy the requirements. But that's not going to be a strong argument when you talk to your boss and saying, I satisfied the requirements even though I got breached.
Yeah, that's a tough day at work for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked a lot about sort of this notion of supply chain, and PCI DSS 4 does have an emphasis on third-party service providers. So let's go into that a little bit. What is all of this? What is all of this new stuff around third-party service management?
Yeah, so this is really a focus on, again, like you said, supply chain management. Because we're more interconnected, both the companies and the software use, the third-party software, and we're even seeing smaller startups are actually being brought into larger companies. So there's a stronger burden. That's a key, and it falls under the one of the primary goals for PCI, under making sure that we address the evolving threats in the industry. One of the evolving threats in the industry, it's not really a threat, but it's just a risk, is this interdependency. So this represents those additional standards that are placed on both the customer and what they call a TPSP. And I'll just go through this very quickly. So the customer, so let's say your customer, Acme, and you're going through a PCI audit. You're going to have to make sure you maintain an inventory of all of your vendors. And when we read through this almost looks exactly like the NIST kind of responsibility matrix. But maintain a current inventory of the third-party vendors, document which PCI DSS requirements your vendor is responsible for. You need to make sure that they explicitly include those compliance constraints in contracts. You also have to periodically monitor or work with your vendors to make sure that they're aligned around compliance. It's just not one and done. And for example, depending on where the third-party service provider falls into your access profile, whether they're managing customer data for you or they're not, they may have to pass a PCI audit, and you need to get a certification, or it may be good enough to just get a letter of attestation from a trusted partner. Now, the TSP has to basically provide the level of visibility for the customer, and they need to also make sure that they work with the customer to engage them if there's any kind of breach, or work with them very closely on that in that respect. So this is really, I don't want to get into too much detail, but fundamentally it's codifying that these partnerships need to be strong, and they're starting to put controls around it.
Yeah, because the supply chain is starting to get complicated, right? When you start thinking about everyone that is involved in delivering your goods and services. So sometimes, okay, so this is a side note, but sometimes people think that marketing makes all the slides. But in fact, this is a slide that you created essentially.
Yes.
And you're very sort of, you told me this is an important thing that really contextualizes this, right? So walk us through what it's showing here and how this can sort of simplify our understanding of the responsibility paths between the third-party vendors.
If you go back to the previous slide, there's one row here where we talk about you have to have a shared responsibility matrix. Okay, mm-hmm. So if you go down here and go to the next one, and so when you have a sample responsibility matrix, what this is really talking about is you have a set of requirements that basically have to be met as a team. When you're getting audited, you are also responsible for all the software, third-party software you deployed within that umbrella of that audit. And what this lays out very specifically is you will have to have a responsibility matrix between you and your vendor. For example, with MFA, you're going to have an MFA solution, and I strongly encourage to have a phishing-resistant one. The customer's responsibility is to configure the MFA policies in the third-party provider's system. So if a vendor comes in and gives you a system, you have to configure it properly so that you get the benefit of that MFA solution. The third-party provider is going to actually have to provide a compliant MFA solution. So they're responsible for making sure that system is designed correctly and is secure. And then there's some shared responsibility where the customer works with the vendor to make sure the configuration is secure, is is configured properly. And then if you go down to the 12.10.1, this is basically you have to establish an incident response plan to address MFA-related security incidents. There's a clear customer responsibility. They have to maintain an IR plan. The third-party vendors have to be part of that, in the sense that you need to understand that if the third-party vendor is breached, you need to have a plan to get notified. And then at the very end of this, it's a big part of the requirements in this area for vendor management is you have to make sure that you have very clear contracts. So I just put a sample of what a contract may look like that codifies this responsibility matrix. And Beyond Identity works very closely with our vendors, with our customers, to make sure that we provide this responsibility matrix. And it's really important that this is an important part of that, because how quickly you can move into the market and turn up a customer is a strong function of how strong your security program is and how you can partner with them.
Yeah, for sure. Spoken like a true practicing CISO, right? There's a security aspect, and then there's a practicality of keeping the business running, right?
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of a strong TPSP or just a third-party service provider, right? You have a line here that I think is great. It's not just about compliance, but it's about a strategic partnership. So share your thoughts on what that looks like.
Yeah. Again, it's and this is how we treat all of our customers. It's really a security partnership. I mean, you have to work with your customers in a way that allows them to achieve their security outcomes or their compliance outcomes. And we can get into all of the other cross the T's and dot I's and contracts and responsibility matrices and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, if you're not a strong partner and start that way, then you won't have a good outcome. And I won't read through all this, but there's some key points here. The first thing is will the service provider work with you to clearly define the boundaries and the scope of the PCI audit, right? You need to work with your customer to make sure that is. And if you're in a situation where you're only touching, like in our case, we actually provide authentication to the CDE, which is the card data environment, but we don't actually process card data. So we can provide what's called an LOA, which we're responsible. We do an internal self-assessment, and we'll provide a letter of attestation that is signed off by our internal security team. If you have to get audited, you need to be proactive about that, and you need to make sure you work with a reputable QSA and provide that information on demand for your partner. You have to have the responsibility matrix, which we just talked about. You need your product needs to be easy to integrate. It has to be secured by default. It's got to be secure by design. If you're delivering a software solution that supports compliance by architecture, that makes you a good vendor. You want to do more security in architecture than operations. You need to have a mature security program so that your customers have confidence that you're monitoring your own systems for breaches, and if something happens, they know that they're going to get notified. You need to participate in regular audits, QBRs. I mean, security is a top concern for all of our customers, and you need to be a good partner and kind of participate in their whatever audit needs that they have. You'll get a lot of requests for vendor risk assessments and security reviews. It's unending. You need to participate in that. My recommendation there is you want to get that as automated as you can and set up some standards and templates and dashboards so that you can respond in hours based on these requests and not days or weeks. And then you have to have a lot of really strong support to make sure that the system is configured and deployed in a way that achieves the security outcomes. So again, when you go through all of this, it's about, are you yourself a mature, is your company practicing mature security principles, and are you a strong partner with your customer?
Yeah. And through that, we can actually do something about the vulnerabilities in our supply chain. So I think some folks may have heard about Beyond Identity, other folks may not. So let's discuss a little bit how we actually help organizations and our customers meet these increasingly stringent compliance requirements.
Yeah. So Beyond Identity provides a very secure authentication solution. It's secure by design. It's simple to administrate. And it's easy to use. What that really means is, from a development standpoint, everything we do has secure by design in it. How we collaborate with our customers, how we build our software, and how we architect our internal security programs, and how we architect our solution. So when we bring that solution to a customer, we understand what their basic security needs are. And again, you can tie these back to the PCI goals. These are pretty standard goals, because from an internal security perspective, because we're driven strongly by the NIST standards and a number of and we hold ourselves to a very high standard. It's very easy for our solution to slot into these different categories. But under risk and governance, we're compliance by design. What that means is, when you deploy our solution on day zero, even if you do the minimum amount of configuration, you get immediate compliance benefits. We have shifted a huge compliance burden, primarily around authentication, which is a huge threat vector, immediately from detection to prevention. So on day zero, when you deploy our solution, you get immediate compliance benefits. It has audit-ready artifacts, which fits right into the ability for logging and monitoring. And it's secure by design, which means the architecture itself is designed in a way to guarantee that security. From an authentication perspective, again, phishing resistance, resistant MFA. We have context-aware authentication, and the solution is it has a number of policy-based and adaptive policy structures, so you can again, it rolls right into the adaptive risk security, which I'll talk about over here on the right-hand side. And then also, from a third-party provider, we ourselves have a very robust internal compliance program, and we're an experienced compliance partner. We have done some of the toughest compliance regimes out there, from FedRAMP to we've done SOC. We've done a number of self-assessments, and we've worked with some of our customers have extremely mature security programs. And then from an adaptive risk security perspective, when you deploy our solution, you immediately get risk signals, behavioral analytics, and device posture. One of the core differentiators for our product is real-time device posture. So when you deploy it, not only do you get a strong authentication and risk signals around authentication, whether that's behavioral stuff, passkey lifecycle, or fast travel, or whatever threat signals, you also get device posture. And then finally, we have a rich set of APIs that allow you to integrate into any kind of SIEM or any kind of SOAR environment, so that you can meet those kind of dynamic risk-based requirements for PCI.
Yeah. I mean, this hits a lot of the core controls that PCI 4 is looking for. So in your journey to sort of assess the viability of different vendors out there, specifically for strong authentication, we hope that we're in the mix, because, as Bob said, we take security extremely seriously. And we have gone through a number of very stringent compliance regimes. So this is one of my favorite topics, right? Because compliance, IT, sometimes there's this misconception in the world that, it's a cost center, right? This is not a business center that's revenue generating. But I think that's a misconception, right? I think we need to turn that framing around and really talk about how we can use this as a way to drive business. I know you have a lot of thoughts here, Bob, so feel free to jump in, and I might supplement with some of my own thoughts.
Yeah, I think great introduction. I think traditionally people have looked at compliance as kind of a back office thing, a risk management thing. It's a check the box kind of thing. And it was really just an internal, every company had its own compliance initiative, and it was always very internal. But I think what we're seeing now, compliance is, and again, as I say, compliance is not only just avoiding penalties, it's a business enabler. So you cannot, if you want to succeed in this market, and you're selling into this market, because we're all interconnected now, and my risk is my partner's risk, and the supply chain risk is everybody's risk. That's the recognition. Compliance is just if you want to even access a market, we see this all the time. You have to prove that you have a secure solution, and you have a solution that is compliant by design. It supports compliance by design. It's also a competitive differentiator, and you can't build trust with customers unless you can show that you are a mature, secure operator. And what's really interesting too is if you look at the RegTech industry, which is the regulatory technology, which is automated compliance, automated GSA, that's a massive industry now. That's growing rapidly. So because of the demands of third-party solutions and larger businesses and even smaller businesses too, like ourselves, because this demand has driven higher burden of compliance, we've moved very quickly to automated compliance. And as you start to deliver into that market, you have to take that into consideration when you sell your product. Yeah. And it can be a huge differentiator, and it can drive significant business.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have direct firsthand experience with this. I joined the company 4.5 years ago, and beyond anything, we're not like a century-old business, right? And I remember we got our SOC 2 Type 2 fairly quickly. And one of the reasons was, my assumption is, we couldn't transact, we couldn't do business because people were asking us for it. Was that a fair assessment?
No, it's interesting. No, that's exactly right. We had to get some of our earliest engagements were a year and a half in as a startup, and we were getting requested. We had to fill out vendor risk assessment forms. We had to have a SOC on it. And now, historically, I've been kind of observing that trend over time. A few companies ago, back in 2015, 2016, it was rare that when you sold your product, anybody asked for anything besides just a really simple security form, which said, do you have an internal security program? That's literally what it came down to. And then very quickly over time, it evolved. Very soon after that, about 2017, 2018, we started to see that all of our customers were asking us for SOC audits. And again, small startup, you think maybe that shouldn't be one of the primary things you're concerned about it, but it came down to we couldn't, I think you said it perfectly, we couldn't transact without not only the compliance, the proof of compliance, but also working with our customers so that we can enable them to achieve their compliance needs. And then that's kind of accelerated, and now you can, if you want to see over that particular time, you'll see the regulatory technology industry exploding, which means like automated compliance, automated auditing, automated integration into GSA and risk management solutions. Because this burden, this is no longer a secondary thing, it's a primary thing, and the companies need to automate that to succeed.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when Vanta came out with their first big splash marketing campaign, it was, I think, something like SOC sucks, and if you know what this means, you need us. And I thought, that's so clever. Yeah, I definitely saw like a real shift in compliance.
Yeah, and we sell our product, and when you're selling your product, you have to consider compliance. It's just the way it is now. The expectation is these things are automated and seamless. And if you're at a larger company, you go into an audit, when you reach out to your vendors, you have to have a higher compliance standard. I mean, it's just because their breach sometimes is your breach.
Yeah. And you can't exactly tell investors, it didn't really happen to us. That doesn't really fly, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the calls to action you have here. Sure. This is what people should be sort of investing their time in pretty much immediately, right?
So right now, again, as we said, as of March 31st, this month, the 4.0 and future best practice, future data requirements are all mandatory. So that means that as you go through your audit program, which a lot of people are scrambling to do now, they need to actually meet those requirements. And remember, 3.2.1 has been sunset. So as you go through your next PCI audit, you're going to have to go against the version 4.0. So the first thing you really need to do is confirm all that your future data requirements are implemented, right? So you look at the version 4.1, 4.0.1, updated to phishing resistant across all CDs. That's a big hurdle, but I would get on that now. Whether you're going to do it internally yourself or you got to find a vendor, that's a big lift. Automated logging alert is for continuous monitoring. You got to get on that right now. You got to take a look at how your systems are architected. You got to find all the legacy systems that don't support that. At this particular point, you probably need to, you have to do just a security architecture review and find out why you have the solutions that you have, and do they meet the minimum set of operational requirements, number one, or do they significantly drive your new security architecture so you can start moving compliance into architecture. You need to start looking at all your third-party vendors and make sure that they understand what they're doing as it relates to compliance. You need to review the contracts and the controls with those vendors. A lot of times we run into this with some of our partners where there have been some vendors that just were signed on years ago, and there's been no updates, no communication. All of that stuff needs to be reviewed. Those contracts need to be reviewed. And then you need to prepare audit evidence aligned with the PCI DSS 4.0.1 templates. So go take a look at those templates and make sure that you understand what they mean and how you're going to align around those. And one last note that I'll make is, again, just like we're seeing compliance is changing from something we had to do to something that needs to be part of the product and something that needs to be just fundamentally part of the product. To be successful in any compliance program in general, in a security program, when it comes to compliance, you should not look at this as just something I have to check off, something I have to do. When you go through a compliance audit, it's an opportunity to assess your own behaviors and your own architecture. And you should ask yourself, am I better than the PCI requirements, or am I better than the NIST requirements? Because you want to be better than those requirements, because those are a point in time. And you also want to reevaluate not only your internal behaviors, but your architecture. It's an opportunity to self-improve and not just a yearly burden.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also like a reframe for everyone working in compliance as well, right? Instead of a burden, it's almost an opportunity to bake security into the DNA or the organization through, as you said, architecture or
Yep.
culture, or ideally both, right? Obviously, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us. We will, from a marketing perspective, make sure that folks who are here get access to all of the resources that we have available for free. We are not even gating it. It's fine. We want to help however we can. So we'll send out the links and the recording and everything else you might need. If you want to chat with us, you know where to find us at beyondunity.com. And last but not least, we do these webinars pretty frequently. So the next one coming up is, software and tech, different industry trends within that. So if you're working within software and tech, I encourage you to join us for that. We occasionally run just demos of our platform. It turns out sometimes folks don't really want to get on a sales call for that. It's okay, not offended, we understand. So we'll run a demo if you want to see the platform in action, specifically around phishing-resistant MFA and some of the adaptive access controls that we allow you to have. That's the place to go. And then last but not least, one of my favorite things to do is dig into recent breaches and figure out what happened. Because once you start, you realize that a lot of the breaches follow a similar pattern of insecure credentials or a device that's not quite configured correctly. So I'm actually going to grab someone from Bob's team, the security team, for the breach analysis. It will be super fun, technical, and detailed. So if you're interested, I think the best place to actually keep in touch right now from a webinar perspective is just to follow us on LinkedIn. I assume all of you have LinkedIns. If you don't, you should make one. It's not a plug for LinkedIn, though. All right. Well, now that I'm rambling, it is time to end the recording. Thank you, Bob, again. Thank you again for speaking to us, taking the time today. And until next time, bye.